The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., receives photographic donations regularly, each one a window into the complex and painful history of slavery in America. But on a cold morning in January 2024, curator Dr. Marcus Washington opens a package that will lead him to uncover the story of one of the most sought-after enslaved artisans in the antebellum South. A woman whose extraordinary skills made her the subject of intense competition among wealthy white families, leading to repeated sales that tore her from every family and community she tried to build. The donation comes from an estate sale in Natchez, Mississippi. The letter explains that the daguerreotype was discovered in a collection of materials from the Whitmore family, one of the wealthiest planting families in Mississippi before the Civil War. The executor thought it significant because of extensive documentation that accompanied it, including bills of sale, letters between plantation owners discussing the woman in the photograph, and testimony she gave after the Civil War about her experiences. Marcus carefully removes the daguerreotype from its case. The image is remarkably preserved, showing a black woman in her early 20s, photographed in what appears to be a formal studio setting. She sits with perfect posture, her back straight, hands folded carefully at her waist. She wears a modest, dark dress, buttoned high at the collar, with a small round brooch and thin white lace trim at the neckline. Her hair is parted cleanly down the center and arranged in a smooth braided crown, emphasizing the symmetry of her features. But it's her gaze that makes Marcus stop and stare. She looks directly at the camera with eyes that are wide, reflective, and extraordinarily intense. There's no smile, no visible emotion, just a composed stillness that feels both dignified and defiant. Her expression is serene yet serious, as if she's challenging the viewer, asserting her humanity and intelligence through the camera lens despite the circumstances that made this photograph possible. Marcus has examined thousands of photographs of enslaved people, and he recognizes something in this woman's direct gaze. A refusal to be diminished, an insistence on being seen as a person rather than property, even while being photographed as part of the documentation of her enslavement. He turns the daguerreotype case over. Inside, written in faded ink on a label, is Sarah, Natchez, Mississippi, 1858. Property of Edmund Whitmore, valued at $2,500. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later, they called her the most desired slave in Mississippi. Not for the reason you think. Her hands created beauty and healing that made her worth more than gold. But every sale destroyed another piece of her soul. Marcus reads the inscription 3 times, understanding beginning to form. Sarah was valued at $2,500 in 1858, an extraordinarily high price for an enslaved person. Most enslaved people were valued between $800 and $200 during this period. The only people who commanded prices over $2,000 were those with extremely rare and valuable skills: master blacksmiths, expert carpenters, highly trained physicians, or artisans whose work was sought after by the wealthy. Sarah had been the most desired slave in Mississippi, not because of sexual exploitation, but because her skills made her incredibly valuable. And that value led to her being repeatedly bought and sold, torn from every community she tried to build, commodified and traded among wealthy families who competed to own her abilities. Marcus spends the rest of that day examining the other materials in the package. There are multiple bills of sale documenting Sarah's ownership changing hands 6 times between 1845 and 1860. There are letters between plantation owners discussing her abilities and negotiating prices. And most importantly, there's a transcript of testimony Sarah gave in 1866 to the Freedmen's Bureau, describing her experiences and seeking compensation for years of unpaid labor. From the earliest bill of sale, dated 1845, one Negro girl, Sarah, age approximately 12, sold by the estate of Thomas Morrison to James Hendricks of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Price, $600. Sarah shows exceptional promise in needlework, herb cultivation, and healing arts. Already literate despite laws forbidding education of slaves. Marcus's pulse quickens. Sarah had been literate at age 12, meaning someone had taught her to read, despite it being illegal in Mississippi, to educate enslaved people. And she already showed skills in needlework, herbal medicine, and healing, abilities that would become more refined and valuable as she grew older. He finds the next bill of sale from 1848. One Negro woman, Sarah, age approximately 15, sold by James Hendricks to Robert Chambers of Natchez, Mississippi. Price, $200. Sarah is accomplished in fine sewing, embroidery, lace-making, herbal medicine, midwifery, and treatment of common ailments. Her needlework is of quality comparable to European artisans. Her medical knowledge has saved numerous lives. Highly recommended for households requiring skilled domestic artisan. Just 3 years later, Sarah's value had doubled. Her skills had developed to the point where she was being described as comparable to European artisans, the highest compliment that could be given in antebellum Mississippi society that looked to Europe as the standard of refinement and culture. Marcus contacts Dr. Helen Richardson, a historian at the University of Mississippi who specializes in enslaved artisans and the underground economy of skills that enslaved people developed despite the system designed to reduce them to unskilled labor. Helen has spent decades documenting cases of enslaved people whose extraordinary abilities made them valuable commodities, leading to lives of repeated sales and family separations. Helen calls him back within an hour. Sarah. I've heard whispers about her in my research. She was legendary in Natchez and Vicksburg before the war. A woman whose needlework appeared in the finest homes, whose herbal remedies were sought by white and black families alike, who could deliver babies and treat illnesses with knowledge that rivaled trained physicians. Send me everything you have. If you found documentation of her full story, this could be groundbreaking. Marcus scans all the materials and emails them to Helen. They arrange to meet at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson, where Helen has already requested plantation records, newspaper advertisements, and any available documentation about skilled artisans in antebellum Mississippi. That evening, Marcus carefully reads through the letters between plantation owners that had been preserved in the Whitmore family papers. What emerges is a picture of Sarah as someone whose skills made her a status symbol among the wealthy. Owning Sarah meant owning access to artistry and healing knowledge that few could match. But it also meant she was never allowed to stay in one place long enough to build a life or family. From a letter written in 1850 by Robert Chambers to a fellow planter. I write to inform you that I am being pressured to sell my woman Sarah, despite my reluctance to part with her exceptional services. Mrs. Whitmore of Natchez has seen samples of Sarah's lacework and embroidery, and is determined to acquire her for her own household. The Whitmores are willing to pay $1,800, a sum I cannot easily refuse, despite Sarah's value to my family. My wife is devastated to lose Sarah, who has become indispensable both for her needlework and her medical knowledge. Sarah delivered our last child safely, when the physician said both mother and baby would die. But business considerations must prevail over sentiment. The sale will proceed next month. From 1852, written by Edmund Whitmore. Sarah has exceeded all expectations since joining our household. Her needlework adorns our home and has become the envy of Natchez society. Ladies throughout the region request her services, and I have profitably hired out her skills to other families. More importantly, Sarah's medical knowledge has proven invaluable. She cured my son's fever when the physician could do nothing. She tends to our field hands' ailments with herbs and treatments that are remarkably effective. I am frequently approached by other planters offering substantial sums to purchase Sarah, but I have thus far refused all offers. She is simply too valuable to my household to consider selling. But Marcus finds a letter from 1855 showing that Whitmore eventually did sell Sarah. I am compelled by financial necessity to sell several of my people, including the woman Sarah. Though she remains the most skilled artisan and healer I have ever encountered, I require capital to expand my cotton operations. William Patterson of Vicksburg has offered 2,200 Lund, and I have reluctantly agreed to the sale. I console myself that Sarah will be well placed in the Patterson household, which is known for treating valued slaves with relative consideration. Marcus and Helen meet at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History 3 days later. The archivist has pulled extensive materials, plantation records, bills of sale, newspaper advertisements, and documents from various churches and aid societies that kept records during this period. They divide the work systematically. Helen takes newspaper archives, while Marcus examines the bills of sale and plantation records. What they discover over the next hours is a pattern that documents Sarah being sold 6 times between 1845 and 1860, each time for increasing amounts as her skills became more widely known, each time torn from whatever community and relationships she had managed to build. Helen finds advertisements in newspapers that help explain why Sarah was so sought after. From the Natchez Courier, 1853. Fine needlework available. The undersigned offers the services of his woman Sarah for commissioned lacework, embroidery, and fine sewing. Sarah's work is of European quality and suitable for the most discriminating households. Inquire at the Whitmore residence on Liberty Street. From the Vicksburg Whig, 1856. Skilled healing woman. Mrs. William Patterson makes available the services of Sarah, a Negro woman of exceptional medical knowledge, for treatment of ailments, midwifery, and herb preparation. Sarah's treatments have proven effective where conventional medicine has failed. Reasonable rates for consultations. They were advertising her like a business, Helen says, anger evident in her voice. These families were profiting from her skills, while Sarah herself received nothing. And every time she became too well known, too valuable, another family would offer more money, and she'd be sold again. Marcus finds the most important document in Sarah's own testimony, given to the Freedmen's Bureau in Natchez in 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended. The testimony is extensive, 15 pages of Sarah's own words, transcribed by a bureau agent describing her life and her repeated sales. My name is Sarah Freeman. I chose the name Freeman when I became free because I had no family name. I was sold away from my mother when I was 12 years old and never saw her again, never knew what name she might have chosen for herself. I was born in 1833 on a small farm in Mississippi. My mother was a healer and midwife who had been brought from Africa as a child. She taught me her knowledge of herbs and healing before I was sold. The white woman who owned us also taught me to read and write in secret, because she was from the north and believed it was wrong to keep us ignorant. When the estate was settled after she died, I was sold to James Hendricks of Vicksburg. Mr. Hendricks discovered I could read and that I had knowledge of healing. His wife taught me fine needlework, embroidery, lacework, delicate sewing. I learned quickly because I enjoyed creating beautiful things, but I did not understand that every skill I developed was making me more valuable as property, was ensuring I would be bought and sold repeatedly throughout my life. In 1848, when I was about 15, Mr. Hendricks sold me to Robert Chambers of Natchez for $200. I was torn away from friendships I had formed, from a young man I had begun to care for, from any sense of home I had started to build. I begged Mr. Hendricks not to sell me, but he said I was too valuable to keep. He needed the money more than he needed my services. For 3 years I served the Chambers family. I created needlework that decorated their home. I treated their illnesses and delivered their babies. I saved Mrs. Chambers's life when she hemorrhaged during childbirth, and the doctor could do nothing. And in return, they sold me to the Whitmores for $1,800. I began to understand that my skills were a curse as much as a gift. Every time I healed someone or created something beautiful, I was increasing my own value as property and making it more likely I would be sold again. But I couldn't stop. It was not in my nature to refuse to help sick people or to deliberately do poor work. Between 1850 and 1860, I was sold 6 times. Each sale brought a higher price, $1,800, then $2,000, then $2,200, then $2,400, and finally $20,500 when Edmund Whitmore bought me back in 1858. Each sale tore me away from people I cared about, from communities I had tried to be part of, from any hope of stability or family. They called me the most desired slave in Mississippi. White women throughout Natchez and Vicksburg society wanted me for my needlework. White families wanted me for my healing abilities. Plantation owners wanted to own me because having me in their household was a status symbol, proof they could afford the most skilled artisan in the region. But every sale killed another part of me. I learned not to form attachments because I would inevitably be torn away. I learned not to love anyone because loving meant suffering when I was sold. I learned to keep my heart closed because opening it meant having it broken again and again. In 1855, I was sold to William Patterson. I had been with the Whitmore family for 3 years, the longest I had stayed anywhere since childhood. I had formed friendships with other enslaved people in the household. There was a man, a carpenter named Samuel, who asked me to marry him in the way enslaved people married, with our community's blessing, if not legal recognition. I had begun to hope that maybe I could stay, that maybe the Whitmores valued me enough not to sell me. But then Edmund Whitmore needed money for his cotton operations. He sold me to William Patterson for $20,200. I was torn away from Samuel, from our planned future, from friends who had become like family. Samuel tried to buy his freedom so he could follow me, but the Whitmores refused to sell him. He was also too valuable. At the Patterson household, I became even more careful to protect myself emotionally. I performed my duties perfectly because I knew imperfect work would result in punishment or sale to somewhere worse. But I refused to care deeply about anyone or anything. It was the only way to survive. The Pattersons hired out my services to other families, collecting fees for my needlework and healing while I received nothing. They advertised my skills in newspapers. I became known throughout the region, and that fame made me even more valuable as property. In 1858, Edmund Whitmore bought me back for $2,500, the highest price ever paid for an enslaved person in Natchez. He wanted me back because other families kept requesting my services, and he realized he could profit more by owning me directly, rather than paying to hire me from the Pattersons. I remained with the Whitmores until the war ended. By the time I was freed in 1865, I was 32 years old. I had been sold 6 times. I had been valued at $2,500, the cost of a small farm. I had created needlework that decorated dozens of wealthy homes. I had delivered hundreds of babies and healed countless sick people. And I had received nothing. No wages, no compensation, no recognition beyond being called the most desired slave in Mississippi. Now I am free, but I have no family. Everyone I might have loved was torn away from me through repeated sales. I have no savings because I was never paid for my work. I have skills that made white families wealthy, but I am starting my life over at 32, with nothing but the knowledge in my mind and the skills in my hands. I file this testimony to document what was taken from me. I deserve compensation for 32 years of unpaid labor. I deserve recognition for the value I created that made others wealthy while I remained property. I deserve acknowledgement that being the most desired slave meant being the most frequently sold, the most repeatedly torn from any hope of stability or family. I do not know if this testimony will result in any compensation. I have been told that former slaveholders are not legally required to pay for the labor they extracted through slavery. But I want my story recorded. I want people to know that being valuable as an enslaved person did not mean being well treated. It meant being a commodity to be bought and sold repeatedly, having your skills exploited while you received nothing, living a life where every relationship was temporary because you knew you would eventually be sold again. My skills survive. I still heal people in the freedmen's community. I still create beautiful needlework, though now I am paid fairly for it. But I will never recover what was taken from me. The years, the relationships, the children I chose never to have, because I could not bear the thought of seeing them sold away from me. This is my testimony. This is what it meant to be the most desired slave in Mississippi. Marcus finishes reading, with tears streaming down his face. Sarah's testimony lays bare the specific cruelty of being valuable as enslaved property, being repeatedly sold, never allowed to build a stable life, having every skill weaponized into a reason for separation and loss. Helen has found more documentation filling in details of Sarah's life after emancipation. From Freedmen's Bureau records in 1867, Sarah Freeman has established herself as a midwife and healer in the freedmen's community in Natchez. She is highly sought after for her skills and is finally receiving fair compensation for her work. From 1870 census, Sarah Freeman, age 37, occupation midwife and seamstress, residing in Natchez, Mississippi, able to read and write. They find that Sarah never married, never had children. In a letter she wrote in 1875 to a missionary organization working with freed people, she explained, "I chose not to marry or have children. The pain of being repeatedly separated from people I loved during slavery was too great. I could not risk forming those attachments again, even in freedom. This is a wound that slavery inflicted, that freedom cannot heal. The inability to trust that relationships will endure, the fear that anyone I love will be taken from me. Sarah lived until 1891, dying at age 58. Her obituary in a black newspaper in Natchez described her as a woman of extraordinary skill and knowledge, whose healing arts and needlework brought beauty and health to the community for decades. Sister Freeman was respected by all who knew her and will be greatly missed. But there was no mention in that obituary of the repeated sales, the commodification of her skills, the trauma of being the most desired slave in Mississippi. Over the following months, Marcus and Helen worked to create an exhibition that tells Sarah's full story. Not just her skills, but what it meant to be repeatedly sold, because those skills made her too valuable to keep. 11 months after Marcus first opened that package, the National Museum of African American History and Culture opens the exhibition, The Cost of Being Valuable, Sarah Freeman and the Commodification of Enslaved Artisans. The exhibition occupies a major gallery designed to honor Sarah while documenting the specific trauma of being repeatedly sold because of valuable skills. The centerpiece is the 1858 daguerreotype. Sarah, at age 25, wearing her modest dress, her hair braided neatly, her gaze direct and unwavering. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. Sarah Freeman was photographed in 1858, just before being sold for the 6th time in her life. She was valued at $2,500, nearly double the price of most enslaved people, because of her extraordinary skills in needlework, healing, and midwifery. But this value meant she was repeatedly bought and sold, torn from every community she tried to build. Her direct gaze in this photograph is an assertion of her humanity, despite being documented as valuable property. The exhibition tells Sarah's complete story through her own testimony. Bills of sale showing her increasing value, letters between plantation owners competing to purchase her, and newspaper advertisements marketing her skills. The progression of sales is documented chronologically, showing how each increase in price represented another separation, another loss. One section focuses on Sarah's specific skills and knowledge. Examples of the type of needlework she would have created are displayed alongside information about the herbal remedies and medical treatments she provided. The exhibition makes clear that Sarah's abilities were extraordinary. Self-taught in many cases, developed through observation and practice, combining African healing traditions passed from her mother with techniques she learned from white families and experimented with herself. Another section examines the broader context of enslaved artisans whose skills made them valuable commodities. Historical documents show that highly skilled enslaved people, blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses, healers, musicians, cooks, were frequently sold for higher prices and faced repeated sales as their reputations grew. The exhibition includes testimony from other formerly enslaved artisans, describing similar experiences of being torn from families and communities because of their value. The exhibition also documents what happened after emancipation. Sarah's work in the freedmen's community, her decision not to marry or have children because of trauma from repeated separations, and her letter explaining that the wounds of slavery couldn't be fully healed by freedom. These all show the lasting impact of commodification and repeated sales. A section on reparations and compensation includes Sarah's testimony requesting payment for years of unpaid labor, and documents showing that her claim, like almost all such claims from formerly enslaved people, was denied. The exhibition contextualizes this within the broader failure to provide compensation to formerly enslaved people for the wealth they created through forced labor. A video plays continuously, featuring historians discussing the economics of slavery, the specific situation of skilled enslaved artisans, and the psychological impact of repeated sales. Descendants of other enslaved artisans share family stories about ancestors whose skills led to frequent sales and family separations. On opening day, Marcus stands in the gallery watching visitors engage with the exhibition. He sees people study Sarah's photograph, understanding gradually that her direct gaze is an act of resistance, an assertion of humanity in an image created to document her value as property. Helen stands beside him, looking at the image. Sarah was 25 years old when this photograph was taken, she says quietly. She'd already been sold 6 times. She'd already learned not to form deep attachments because she knew she'd be sold again. She'd already lost Samuel, the man she planned to marry, because her value as property meant she could be sold at any time. But look at her eyes. There's no submission there, no defeat. There's dignity and determination, even defiance. She's looking at the camera, at us, across 166 years, and insisting we see her as a person, not property, despite everything done to her. A young black woman who's a medical student approaches them. "My great-great-great-grandmother was a midwife and healer during slavery," she says. "Family stories say she was sold multiple times because her skills were valuable." Reading Sarah Freeman's testimony, understanding that being skilled didn't protect enslaved people, but actually made their lives harder in some ways, it helps me understand what my ancestor went through. An elderly white woman stops to read the bills of sale, showing Sarah's increasing value. "These documents are written like livestock sales," she says, her voice shaking. "They're describing a human being with extraordinary intelligence and skills, but they're reducing her to a commodity with a price." Sarah Freeman was worth $2,500 to Edmund Whitmore, more than many white people earned in years, but she received nothing. That's the obscenity of slavery. It recognized people's value only to exploit it. Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, understanding that being the most desired slave in Mississippi wasn't a story of privilege or better treatment, but a story of repeated sales, commodification of skills, and the specific trauma of being valuable property in a system that recognized your abilities only to exploit them while denying you any compensation or stability. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Marcus walks through the gallery one more time. He stops in front of Sarah's photograph, looking at her composed expression, her direct gaze, her carefully maintained dignity in a photograph created to document her value as property. He thinks about Sarah Freeman, 12 years old when first sold away from her mother, developing extraordinary skills in healing and needlework, becoming so valued that she was sold 6 times in 15 years for increasing prices. Never allowed to build a stable life or family, because her value as property always led to another sale. He thinks about her living until 1891, freed in 1865 at age 32, spending 26 years in freedom, but never marrying, never having children, never fully recovering from the trauma of repeated separations. He thinks about her testimony requesting compensation for 32 years of unpaid labor. Work that made white families wealthy, needlework that decorated their homes, healing knowledge that saved lives, and how that compensation was denied because the legal system that had upheld slavery refused to recognize that those who had been enslaved deserved to be paid for the value they created. And he thinks about the thousands of other enslaved artisans whose skills made them valuable commodities, whose abilities led to repeated sales and family separations, whose knowledge and creativity enriched white families while they received nothing. The photograph waited 166 years to tell Sarah's full story. The image that was created to document her value as property has become testimony to her humanity, her extraordinary skills, and the specific trauma of being repeatedly sold because those skills made her too valuable to keep. Now, the photograph has fulfilled a purpose Sarah surely intended when she looked directly at the camera with that unwavering gaze. Her story has been told, her skills have been recognized, her humanity has been asserted, and her testimony about what it meant to be the most desired slave in Mississippi has been preserved and honored. As visitors file past the image one last time, many stopping to look at Sarah's eyes and see the person behind the property value, the intelligence behind the commodified skills, the trauma behind the composed expression, Marcus thinks about all the other skilled artisans who were repeatedly sold, all the other people whose abilities made them valuable property, all the other stories of commodification and separation that deserve to be uncovered and told. Sarah Freeman, born 1833, sold 6 times between 1845, 1860, freed in 1865, lived until 1891, never fully recovered from the trauma of repeated sales, but used her freedom to serve her community as a healer and artisan, finally receiving fair compensation for skills that had once made her the most desired enslaved person in Mississippi. Her story has been told. Her testimony has been heard. Her humanity has been honored. And Marcus is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that Sarah Freeman is remembered not as valuable property, but as an extraordinary woman whose skills, intelligence, and dignity persisted despite a system designed to reduce her to a commodity.